Well, we're back. This is our old Kentucky home. It's been a long time. Does anybody remember what we talked about the last time? I was trying to
We're
think.
we're old. We don't remember
Yes.
squat.
Well, I'm pretty sure we talked about being old at the time. But anyway, yes, it's been what, 6 months, a year? I don't know. It's been a long time, and I think the last time I think maybe just was a generic chat with a bunch of other folks. But anyways, whatever it is. But we are back, so the boys are back in town, and this is our old Kentucky home. And I'm Russ, and Dave, you're.
And back to your reference, I am no longer a thin Lizzie.
Oh, there you are. Yes, you can always count on the highest levels of humor coming from us. And Roy in the corner is we now know an anti-American, American-hating communist cuck, I believe it was.
I believe that was what I was called. Yes.
We're not
And
entirely sure what a cuck is, but
a homo communist today. So
it
yes.
doesn't sound
Uh,
nice. But
it does. Well, yeah, it's hard without a wife to be a cuck, but okay, we got that. But I'm glad that we're all here and we're on video now, so they can see that we actually do put the old in our old Kentucky home.
we
So
definitely do. So tonight we thought we've been summoned back, as it were. Was it who can do a good Al Pacino? They keep pulling me back, and we thought we would talk about politics, but not that politics, because that's completely off limits tonight. And in fact, I have a penalty box. Anybody who says the T word has to pay into it. Has to read all my Substacks and my books that I've got on my hard drive. So that's the penalty if anybody says the T word. And I don't mean transubstantiation or Trafalgar. Anyway, I think you all get the idea. So anyway, we're going to have a crack at talking a little bit about politics from our old Kentucky home, which is to say the period of time when we were in high school or living in Bardstown or living, in that general area. And I think the conversation will range far and wide, and there may be a few glimmers of, I don't know, foreshadowing of what we're experiencing right now. But anyway, that's where it is. I thought we would start maybe with memories of your first political memory. That is, can you think of the first time you encountered anything political, for whatever that means? And we'll leave it open for that.
I'm not sure you would consider this political, but it is related. The first real political thing I can remember is seeing the horse-drawn carriage with the flag draped across it, carrying President Kennedy's body down Pennsylvania Avenue, and the pictures. And so that may not be completely political, but certainly related.
Yeah, I think it's the first contact that we as children would have had with anybody like that, in any political figure. I remember seeing, and it must have been shortly before this, because I was 4, I think, when he was shot, and I saw him in Nashville. There was a motorcade. We'd all gone to the corner of the streets, and what I recall, dozens of motorcycles going by, and that was what really stuck in my head. And then this car went by, and this guy waving, and oh, there he is. And I seem to have known him. I mean, I have this impression. We were talking before we started recording that memories are peculiar things, and I may have mushed that in with pictures that I've seen. But I'm pretty sure he was in Nashville at the time, and he drove by. Roy, what are your
I
thoughts?
well, I have. I mean, since we're on the subject there, I have this flashbulb memory of hearing when he was assassinated on the radio. I was at my grandmother's house. Now, flashbulb memories are just as unreliable as any other. But I do seem to remember sitting on the stairs, hearing on the radio and being shocked that, the president had been killed. I didn't have any opinion of him because I was like, as you say, 4, but I do remember that. And then the that's my earliest memory along things like that.
No,
Most of it was, Johnson and from then on. So
yeah. I think probably my first memory of a political event kind of thing would have been a speech by Lyndon Johnson. I like to think it was the speech in which he announced that he wasn't running for president, but I've seen that so many times on television that I'm sure I have combined that with my real memories. But I know I've seen that. Probably the more distinctive memories I have of political figures of certainly during the 60s was of David Frye, the comedian and impressionist, doing Richard Nixon and Lyndon Johnson and all the others, usually on the Smothers Brothers show.
Mm-hmm.
And so that I have more memory of the comedian of that than I do probably of the actual figures themselves.
I remember hearing and seeing Johnson on the news in relation to Vietnam, but not really hearing his speeches so much. But I do remember associating that strongly with the things that were going on at that time. Strangely enough, I have no memories whatsoever of the civil rights stuff he was doing from that period, which
I don't have any.
I don't think I
memory
do
of
either.
that. Yeah, although I will say I have memories of watching the evening news, watching students on college campuses around the country. I think more specifically at Berkeley, where they would contain set-ins, and where they would discuss that they were protesting. I guess the students were mostly protesting the Vietnam War, but I also have memories, and again, I don't know whether this is newsreel or whatever, of Martin Luther King, and certainly the coverage surrounding Martin Luther King. And I certainly remember watching television the evening that he was shot, and of course they interrupted the news. And of course, my dad was a big fan of Martin Luther King's, and when they said that, I can remember going back to my dad saying, they shot Martin Luther King, and he kind of looked at me with this inquisitive, kind of disturbed look, like, what? And of course, he got up and came back into the den to watch the news footage with me. And I don't really remember what they said. I just remember they're sitting there with him and watching the news. So,
yeah, I remember that. And then shortly after that, I mean, a month and a half after the assassination of Robert Kennedy, right. And I remember having a newspaper, with the headlines and with the big headline and a picture of him lying on the ground. So both of those, impacted me in some way that, I can't go back and put together those thoughts. But the images are very distinctive at that time. Interesting. I think a lot of times the events of that time were tied into television, because I remember it must have been the 6-Day War, in that I wanted to watch the Smothers Brothers because I think Buffalo Springfield were going to be on, but it was interrupted because the 6-Day War was on, and the the UN Security Council was in session. And so there were all these meetings. I didn't really understand any of that, but I just knew there was something going on in the Middle East that had interrupted this program that I wanted to see. And so, all of those kind of things kind of tied together. We were living in this funny little rented house before I moved to Middletown, Kentucky, just outside of Louisville. And so my brother had his teenage lair was down in the basement, this window, this room that must have reeked of teenage boy. But anyway, he had a TV down there. And so we'd go down to watch stuff. I can't imagine what the reception must have been like watching snow, must have been like watching anything in Maine, when the snow's really down. But yeah, so the 60s were like that. These flashing images that always had something to do with television, which of course is the ongoing theme that we always talk about Vietnam as being the TV war.
Yeah. Well, they did interrupt things a lot back then for news flashes and stuff that these days, well, of course I don't watch network news, but doesn't seem to be, or networks, but it doesn't seem to be quite as prevalent as it was then to interrupt or maybe we just felt more that was aggrieved because we wanted to watch the show that was on. Smothers Brothers.
Well, and it always seemed to happen, as you say, about 8 o'clock at night when you were wanting to watch something. And I, for me, I always remember it had something to do with putting a man in space, but which was one of Kennedy's initiatives, because we were so scared the Russians were going to take over space. We needed to get up there with a presence as well.
Yeah, they were going to drop bombs on us from space platforms.
Yeah.
Not entirely sure if that works if you just drop a bomb, but somehow or another that was the.
You can drop a piece of steel apparently, and it works quite well as a bomb. But I was such a nerd. Anything that was space related, I was there. I was glued to the screen. But I wasn't so much up on current events, as Mr. Hanratty was perfectly happy to point out to the current events class.
Well, this wasn't politics, but do you remember where you were when? But it was, because all this kind of stuff, as we've just been saying, was politics. Do you remember where you were when Armstrong sat down on the moon?
Yep, I was watching the TV, the old black and white TV, and my dad had dozed off, and I was the only one watching the the thing, because it was late at night, as I recall, when it was telecast. But those grainy images from that time.
And it took forever, because he stood on that last step for what seemed like forever. I mean, what's the difference, mate? Just go ahead.
Buzz, push him.
You've established that the thing will hold this rocket. You can step down; it'll be fine. He was trying to remember. Now, what was it? Is it one small step? Is it a big step?
Yeah, man, not to screw it up for everybody.
Yeah. So I remember that my dad came and got me. He said, "You need to come watch this. You need to come watch this." And so I got out of bed and went into the den, and I could not really make out what was on the screen. I mean, it was so fuzzy, and you could hear the beep and the talking from NASA and the back and forth. But for the life of me, I could not make out what this was on the screen. And my dad said, "This is the greatest technological achievement of mankind." And the only thing I could think of is if that's true, how come the picture isn't any better?
Yeah. Well, they forgot to take tinfoil to put on the leads and whack the side of the converter.
Watching that, and then when they cut back to Walter Cronkite, he was crying, and
he was big on that in television, wasn't he?
Yes, he was.
I was at summer camp up in southern Indiana. And my friend and I were flirting with these two girls. And so we periodically, I mean, as 10-year-olds, there's only so much, repertoire you have. But, periodically we'd pop into the main room where everybody was watching, again, a very cloudy black and white television. He said, "Has he not stepped down yet?" And I think I probably saw it, but I'm not entirely sure that I cared that much. But, at 10 years old, I was there, but I was somewhere else as well.
The nerd here was taking up the slack for you, so you're good.
Well done. So the go ahead, Dave.
I was going to say, and also being from Louisville, I remember a lot of discussion about Muhammad Ali, Cassius Clay becoming Muhammad Ali, and the stories around Ali, and just the thing, whether he's a man of his time or what, he seemed to be at the central point of both the civil rights movement and the Vietnam War movement. Mm-hmm. Both from his stance, changing his name from what he said was his slave name from Cassius Clay to his free name, Muhammad Ali, and then the declining to enter the army after he was drafted because of his stance against the Vietnam War. So, there seemed to be a lot of discussion, and favorably so, around his ability to stand up and speak. However great anybody thinks of him as a spokesman, however, I guess visceral some of his speaking was, I remember a lot about Ali not fighting, and then a lot about what happened when Ali did step back in the ring. Yeah. In terms of just the ability to be able to do that.
I had a somewhat slanted view of that because my family was more bigoted than you could possibly imagine. Yeah. And the things I was hearing was not the kind of thing that, was common in the, hopefully common in the culture, although it was kind of common in the culture. It took me many years, or a few years anyways, to figure out that my family was full of shit and that, that Muhammad Ali was a great man. So, yeah.
I mean, he was a real polarizing figure at that time
Oh, yeah.
because,
Yeah,
for
definitely.
all the reasons that we now know, it was much easier to sort of, go with the, well, he's not being, friendly and nice like,
Right.
whoever, name X or Y or Z. And that was always difficult for the the dominant group to deal with. But yeah, no. So the '60s were obviously fraught, and we were in the middle of it, but we're ever so slightly younger. So I think our input with it. You guys remember any Kentucky campaigns at all for governor or senator or anything?
Catherine Peden ran for governor, and I have no idea who Catherine Peden was.
Ooh.
I just remember that her nickname was Katie, and she had these clickers. And I don't know if you remember them. They're like metal, and and she put her logo on them like a Katie did. And the motto was, whatever happened, Katie did. And you would click the clicker, and it was supposed to sound like like a Katie did.
Yeah.
Doug,
All right.
And I remember being at the state fair, and you hear these things clicking everywhere.
Oh.
So, and you wonder, unscientific polling with the number of clickers that I heard at the state fair, you wonder why she never won the governorship.
Oh.
But anyway.
I think she was the sister of the Pedens who owned the convenient supermarket or mini mart things that were next to the Dairy Queen, because they were involved in the church that Dad preached for. I think that's her. I may be wrong, but I'm going to stand on that. Unless somebody really wants to go into the into the New York Public Library, Wikipedia, and find out. I think that's what it is. The governor, one I remember, was Louis Nunn versus, I think it was Wendell Ford, who wound up being a senator for a long time. But I remember Louis Nunn's going to get things done. Louis Nunn, but the Democrats always said Louis Nunn is running for fun.
I always heard after. Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, I think you were going to say what I was going to say, Roy. Go
ahead. 49 states have governor and Kentucky has none. Was the thing I always heard afterwards.
Yeah. I don't think he really goes down in huge, historical perspective in Kentucky. But then again, the bar's pretty low when it comes to Kentucky politics, at least in terms of recent years. But we're not going there yet. Remember, I'm staying away, and I've already read my Substack, so I have to do something else.
Yeah, I have a cousin who was 14 years older than me, and I remember when Harvey Sloan ran for governor. Harvey Sloan was the mayor of Louisville, and so he was very involved with Harvey's campaign. I don't remember who was governor at the time, but when the governor left, the lieutenant governor was a woman by the name of Thelma Stovall. Thelma was also running for governor, and so when the governor left the state, she's the acting governor, and she immediately calls a special session and calls all the people back into Frankfort for who knows what. And again, I just remember, my cousin being really upset about all that, trying to do an end run around Harvey, and really didn't matter, because then 2 to 3 months later, just out of the blue, John Y. Brown Jr. enters the race and just catches fire. And I remember that John Y. Brown Jr. and Phyllis George, remember Phyllis George, the beauty queen, that Miss America. And so
CBS broadcaster for sports as well.
Yeah. And so the volunteer firemen, I remember that they all lined up for a picture. And I don't remember who it was. It was maybe Carrie Munnan or somebody. Somebody said, well, what was it like to stand next to Phyllis George? And he said, she put her arm around me and says, well, what was that like? And he said, well, she pulled me close. And said, well, what did you do? He says, well, I pulled her closer.
I'm pretty sure you'd be canceled for that these days, and
Yeah.
but maybe she would, because maybe it's the reversal ones.
Well, speaking of
Yeah,
Harvey,
yeah. I don't
oh,
remember. I remember John White being governor. I remember when, but this is a little ahead of ourselves because I think it was about 1980. He was still governor, and when Louisville and Kentucky played each other in the Mid East Regional Finals, he wore a red and blue suit. You know, so there he is.
well, I still remember from because Harvey Sloan there reminded me. I always liked Sloan when we lived in Louisville. Thought he was a good mayor. What I know, but I remember that this unknown alderman ran against him, this Mitch McConnell guy.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Speaking of low bars, uh,
Yeah.
yeah, my mother was involved in the what was it? Well, women's club. I can't remember what it's called now, but homemakers.
Hmm.
And he came to speak to them once, and apparently he was late, and he was really grumpy, and I don't think he was terribly illuminating. And that was when he was still in city government. So
Yeah.
it was a foretaste of things to come. Which reminds me, while we were, right about that time, and probably after we graduated, was the whole ERA thing, and my mother was involved again with the homemakers club, going to sort of protest against the signing of the ERA because they had all drunk the Phyllis Schlafly Kool-Aid,
Hodge Phyllis
which is
Schlafly, yeah.
one of my regrets about my late mother, bless her soul. But I think she always regretted it as well. I think she got sucked into this kind of movement, but we're slightly ahead of ourselves because that's graduation time. I think we should go back to the early '70s because there's not much went on in that period while we were in school.
Not at all.
Anyone want to start in on what might have gone on when we were in high school?
All I can say is that my vivid memory is coming in from school, and I don't know why my dad would be home, but he was glued to watching the Watergate hearings. And I just remember him saying something to me, one of the guys that testified, he said, either this guy is telling the truth or he's a really good liar. And so I just seemed that just went on forever.
Yeah.
Probably only lasted a month or something, but it just seemed like it went on and on and on.
I think it was most of the summer because I remember at one point I sprained my ankle doing something, so I was stuck at home, and they were on all day. And I'd watch. I mean, I remember seeing John Dean's testimony and various other ones, and I remember the guys online, and Howard Baker and all of those people. So yeah, it was a fascinating time, and I can't say that I ever had any big picture of what had gone on, or nor could have summarized any of it. Um, remember when we were? It was, I think we were in geometry because I think Mo was talking about it. Remember when Agnew stepped down, or
Oh,
was kicked out, as he would say afterwards, or
yeah.
was thrown under the bus, or any number
By
of other
those
uh,
pusillanimous pussyfooters, yes. So
yeah, yeah. What was it? Nattering nabobs of negativism. I used to use that as, if you want to talk about alliteration, there he's your guy. But so it was a fascinating time because I remember distinctly, essentially being Republican in orientation because my dad always said he was, and I remember we were in Atlanta, Georgia, at some friend's house, and we didn't have a color television at the time, and they did, and the Republican National Convention was on in 1968, and I remember seeing Nixon's speech at that time, and then all of the colorful balloons coming down, and then when the Democratic convention came on, it was in black and white, and I couldn't, I didn't remember seeing anything. I don't remember any of the stuff that goes along with that now. Just remember thinking, oh gosh, that was a really good speech for old Nixon. He's going to be a good one. Uh, And
Well, I remember, I do remember newscasts talking about, all the protests in the street in the 68 convention for the Democratic, but that's a very vague memory.
yeah,
Um,
I
so
don't have much about that until I think until I was much older and had read about it. You heard about stuff like that, but vague memories of Eugene McCarthy, but only vague. I remember, so it's one of those strange kind of times that are so distinctive, but the memories are fairly vague. Uh, but as we were talking before we started recording, things were partisan, but it wasn't the same. And at that time, it was really strange because the force or the subject of everybody's ire was actually Lyndon Johnson, the Democrat, Mr. Liberal for a while, until Vietnam came, because he passed the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act and done all these other things, and yet squandered it all, sending people, especially the people that supposedly were going to be the subject of his bills, to Vietnam. And so he was universally hated in 1968, stepped down. And Nixon, who said he had a plan to end the war, very quickly, oh gosh, where have we heard that before? Oh, no, nope, not going to say it.
Nope, nope.
But anyway,
No, no.
these things have happened before. So, anybody got any other memories about that?
well,
Oh, go ahead.
go ahead, Roy,
No, I go really go ahead.
because my memory's skipping ahead to Nixon leaving the White House. So maybe
Well,
your
I
time
remember
frame is.
the end of the Vietnam War and the kind of ignominious airlift off the roof
Yeah.
of the embassy and stuff, or consulate, whatever it was.
What?
That's
Just a quick interjection, Roy. You know, I stood in front of this past January, a year and 13 months ago, on the lawn of the presidential palace there in Saigon, looking at the spot where the helicopter lifted off. And the guide that was with us said, they said that was the consulate in the US Embassy, but he said that's actually the CIA headquarters.
oh well, is there a difference in most countries though?
Well, I don't know, but he made a point that
That's
we knew that was not the embassy, that was the CIA headquarters.
cool.
Yeah.
No.
And I don't know how much of my memory of the whole thing is tainted by watching Miss Saigon either. So
Yeah.
so the helicopter at the time was suspended from the ceiling, right?
I
Wasn't that
think
how
it
that?
was, yeah, yeah. And it
Yeah,
just goes out of frame, and then everything is
yeah,
fine.
yeah, yeah. It's
What?
something like that. A lot of singing. I don't know something.
Yeah. That was a fascinating time, and I remember. Well, you may remember this. We were in, I think, a phase elective class or something with Mrs. Locke, and we were trying to debate her on whether or not Nixon's de-Vietnamization or Vietnamization plan and de-escalation plan was working. And we were trying to defend, him, and she was saying, well, he's moved him from here to there and all that kind of stuff. Of course, I don't think we knew about Cambodia at the time. So, but distinctly remember being a big Nixon defender.
Yeah, I just remember at that point not really, whoever was in, I wasn't as partisan as I am now. I don't think I could have
Yeah,
been, but
yeah,
and I like you, I was also a Republican at that point, until college basically. But I just don't. I remember, the president was the president, and they screw up or they wouldn't screw up. But I don't remember being virulently anti anybody, whether it was even Johnson or Nixon or Carter. Just kind of, okay, they're president, So,
yeah. They
but
were who they
Well,
were, and there was a little bit more deference. And until I guess Watergate, in which it was absolutely clear that he was guilty, and I think it took me up to the point of the House Judiciary Committee voting against him when the smoking gun came out, and I couldn't have told you at the time what the smoking gun was. And I think we were in, because it was August, wasn't it? August '74. And I think we were in vacation Bible school at the church, and I was there and doing something, handing out Kool-Aid or something like that, and then went back home, and they were all Catherine Mackin and Dan Rather and all the big guns from CBS were there hanging around afterwards, essentially saying, can you believe what we've just been covering all this time? And can you believe this happened? And, you talk about your constitutional crisis. What do you do except for the fact that the Constitution wasn't in crisis because it actually worked. And everybody worked together to make it work, including Republicans, whose interest it was to defend him. And one could argue, the offenses, depending on who's writing the book, are either fairly minor or the most severe that we've ever experienced. And I think from a practical point of view, I don't think they were that severe. But on the other hand, this guy's running this paranoid internal investigation unit against his enemies. That's pretty serious. And he stepped down.
It is. But I do want to give, in hindsight from the years now, you got to give Nixon a little bit of credit because he voluntarily stepped out of the office when he was caught red-handed. I don't think that would happen today.
Yeah.
And I don't want to go further than what you said either, but my point is that given all the turmoil at the time, things seemed to work differently because Nixon chose to make them work differently.
Yeah.
Well, it was clear that the Republicans were going to back the Constitution over the president.
Yeah.
I think it was just a different time when partisanship hadn't trumped, hadn't clobbered.
We'll give you the pass.
When partisanship hadn't
you have to read one of my shorter ones.
Hadn't gained ascendancy over love of country and what we historically think of as following the Constitution and the it was as you say a different time.
Well, I think historically, people, this is the sort of atomic response to problems, and people have been reluctant to do that. So, 1868, they don't convict Andrew Johnson. Of course, if you look at the charges against him, they're fairly made up. But at the same time, it was the dominant Democratic Party who'd made them up, and he had violated these made up rules. And yet the democratically dominated Senate refused to convict because they thought this is not the way we want to do this. And they knew it was mostly political. It was political for good reason. I mean, Johnson was an appalling president and deserved to be out for very political reasons, which is what impeachment actually is. It's political violations, not high crimes, misdemeanors, that sort of thing. But it's not necessarily criminal behavior, and it isn't having illicit blowjobs in the dish room in the White House. But even though that does tend to demean the presidency, but that would be the C word.
Yes.
Who also obviously refused to step down.
Yeah.
So it's a tricky thing. But if on the other hand, if impeachment doesn't mean anything because you can never get both parties, then what point is it? And I think that's something that people will look at in the future, whichever way it goes. But that's for another podcast, maybe another two years when things are more interesting still, because we always think we've reached the last level of interest and it moves on from there. We were largely small c conservative, I think, and that's probably not surprising. I mean, regardless of our extracurricular interests as teenage boys, largely I think that's probably what we were and what most of our colleagues were. We've shifted slightly, blown with the wind and gone a bit left. Some of ours have not. What do you reckon? What are your thoughts about that?
Well, I think some of it is if I start to say the most stupid thing, the local zeitgeist. that has no meaning. But I think it was the local area too. It remained conservative or fairly conservative, the whole state. Um, I mean, we've seen the shift, not so much from, radical Democrats to Republicans, but from Southern Democrats, which were essentially Republicans, to Republicans in that area. And I think that maybe the folks who stayed there are still a little bit more affected by that than those of us who may have gone elsewhere, traveled and settled in more liberal areas. Not yours necessarily, David, but but settled in other areas. And I don't know, maybe. And if I guess one thing that plucking us out of any situation, and shoving us somewhere else is we no longer are as influenced by our peers as we were, and so we have new peers, and we tend to think less group think and more thinking. I think the same would happen. If Bardstown had been a bastion of liberalism and they'd taken us out of there and plopped us down in Georgia, we probably would have moved to the right.
Yeah,
That's
yeah.
my opinion, anyways.
I think I don't know how to say this without it maybe offending some people, but I think some people would say you guys left home and you went to liberal colleges and you were brainwashed by those people at those liberal institutions that you went to, because now you're thinking different and so on. And I don't really think of it as that. I mean, from my own personal experience, it's hard not to go through business school without coming out thinking Republican.
Yeah.
Because if you think about, businesses as their own entity and businesses being run a certain way, so I don't think it's completely the fact that that we would have gone to other institutions, but I think you have to leave home to broaden your horizons and get something other than the peer pressure that you spoke about, Roy. So that it helps you think through different things. Now, that doesn't mean that the experience that they see at home is any less valid. I mean, I could see if you're stuck in a geographical area and you think, well, they're always talking about someone else getting a benefit, then why not me? Because I'm just as deserving as that someone else. Mm-hmm. So and like I said, I don't mean to offend anybody, but it just is tough when your mind doesn't stretch 50 miles beyond your own home.
Yeah. And I think you're right about the business school. And I went to an engineering college. They're not really known as flaming liberals either, right? I mean, it's hard to have a liberal or a conservative electronic circuit, and engineers are quite conservative most of the time. And you went to David Lipscomb, so I assume that was not really a raging liberal college. So.
We were called David Liberal, but that was only in comparison to the very, very right-wing schools that surrounded us. Yeah.
Belmont.
Well, no, Belmont was incredibly liberal. No, there's a place called Freed-Hardeman down in Henderson, Tennessee, and that was about as right-wing as you can get. And then there, I mean, even Abilene, which was more liberal than Lipscomb. These are both religious schools for anybody watching who doesn't know. They're Church of Christ schools, and so it's so extreme to the point where we don't believe in instrumental music and we believe in inerrancy of the Bible and all that. And my politics and everything else went completely to the left, and ultimately I left that brand of religion, and then religion entirely. But that wasn't necessarily because of the school, but I guess the friends you find in college also matter. So if I'd gotten in with a bunch of preacher kids and stuff, probably would have been a heroin addict, because that's the typical preacher's kid. But
practically happened to me. I got in with this preacher's kid that I lived with for a few years, and geez. That would be David for those of you.
Yeah. Let's just say that we drove each other to drink.
Yeah,
that's it.
yeah. It was living out on Strawberry Lane,
in
which was also a very liberal area of town.
Oklahoma.
Yeah,
which was also a very liberal area of town.
Yes,
there you are. But anyway, it has to do with the people you hang with. Yeah.
Yeah. One other comment, though. I think that at the core of it, in some regards, I think maybe I am still Republican, but the Republican Party has moved so far to the right. And you've got people who have, I think, maybe had good points, but they've taken those points to extreme. Mm-hmm. And when you go to the extreme side of those points, somehow it just doesn't seem to be logical any longer. And so it comes back to talking about where the middle ground is.
Yeah.
So
when I graduated from Lipscomb in 1979, I worked for about 3 months in the Tennessee State Legislature, and it was predominantly Democrat, but that was the old yellow dog Democrats. They'd vote for a yellow dog if he was a Democrat. And they weren't particularly left, and virtually any sort of progressive legislation tended to get wiped out. But there was a lot of working across the aisles. And there were stories at the time and afterwards, books written about how Tennessee was the almost ideal model for bipartisan working at the state level. You'd get different governors. Lamar Alexander was a sort of moderate Republican, and then you had Democrats and things like that came in. Now it is the poster state for extreme partisanship, and it's gerrymandered to the point where Republicans have Democrats have almost no say, and certainly most progressive Democrats who tend to be African American in Tennessee are, almost ghettoized, to use that term in so many uses, in Memphis and certain parts of Nashville, and probably Chattanooga and Knoxville, but with very little input. Same is true in Texas. When I was in Texas after that, Ann Richards, one of the great liberal women in Democratic politics, was governor. And that ain't happening anymore, because Texas has shifted way to the right as well. So the South has gone very right wing, and you can take one of my history classes and learn all about the Southern strategy if you want, but also just, you can just look around and see that that's the case. And it never was that way before, but it was shifting even from the Nixon years. So without going off onto a lecture, that tells you the world that we lived in has changed. When we grew up and we were young men, it has changed to a very, very different picture now.
Well, and you mentioned bipartisanship. That's something that was valued, and politicians of that time working across the aisle was extremely common, and compromise was common. It wasn't the sin that it is now. To work either direction, really. And people like Biden, and even back in those days, when he was a young senator, and other folks at that era are known for bipartisanship, and for talking across the aisles, and even up to Reagan. Reagan and Tip O'Neill were drinking buddies, right? And
Yeah.
it was a time when people could disagree without hating each other, or at least keeping the hatred under control. So,
and it was a matter of self-preservation of the West and what we thought of as freedom. It was the
yes.
Cold War consensus, which prevailed from 1945 until about 48 hours ago. and
you're getting close to that, having to read your
yeah, I haven't said it yet.
Yep.
I still have time, but Time Magazine will probably say something about it. But really was, we recognized it, and I frequently again talk about this. You kind of miss the Soviet Union sometimes because you knew who your enemy was, but you also knew they knew who their enemy was, and they also knew what the consequences were. And until after Stalin died, really there was essentially sane people who'd lived through the Second World War and knew what it was all about, didn't think you could win, and therefore, we kind of played the proxy wars and stuff, and it wasn't exactly peace in our time, but it wasn't World War III. And those assumptions changed in 1989, 1993, 1992, and now we're in a world where who knows? And so I, for some reason or other, that let the shackles off of bipartisanship, if you want to say that that's a shackle, and give everybody freedom to go in the directions they wanted to.
Well, also when we were in high school and growing up, everyone watched the same news.
Yeah,
Everyone lived in the same world. You know, the idea of there being such a thing as an alternate fact would have been laughed at
yeah,
because it's nonsensical. And we all participated in the same discussion on a national level. And then with the rise of cable news and even more so with the internet, then the niches started popping up, and people could go down their niches and never come in contact with reality again. And so we don't live in the same worlds anymore. It's very difficult to talk to people or to, anything like
And
that.
it's
yeah,
and it's even very difficult to find a news source that you think you can trust. I mean, you've got to think critically, and it doesn't matter whether you're what strand or what thread you've fallen down, whether you think it's right or not, because even when you think it's the truth, maybe it's not the complete truth.
yeah.
And it just, you have to learn to read and listen and look to things and kind of hear where the fact is and where opinion is coming in. And it's very difficult to do that.
It's harder. You have to look at multiple sources and think and really, actively think as you consume media. Not that we were, I guess it's not great to think, well, we didn't have to think when old Walter was around. He could just tell us what to think. But, you know,
And the tech has changed things as well. I mean, I blame you basically, Roy. Upon you are all the sins in the world. But I saw a clip that was a riff on recent events, and one of the characters very realistically punched out the other one, very realistically, and we all knew it was a fake. And yet, if somebody from somewhere else saw it, they wouldn't necessarily, because, obviously you could analyze it, you can do all the things that we can do to check it, and it seems it is absurd, and yet it is so realistic. And we live in a world where we could never entirely trust pictures. I mean, Matthew Brady kind of staged some of his Civil War shots because, you've got exposures that last a minute and a half. You can't tell the soldiers to stop. But at least he wasn't, putting mannequins there and painting backdrops and stuff like that. Whereas now all of that can change, and it makes just knowing what you could know a very much more complicated process. And it's much more easy to say, oh, I saw this thing on what, or X or something. It must be true. Or even if it isn't, it probably is like being true, because we kind of do these layers of truth. So it becomes more and more difficult.
yeah. And that's certainly not going to get any better. It's,
No.
photorealistic pictures, and that makes sense. And movies and things like that are now producible on a laptop. I mean,
Yeah.
the AIs now will run on our laptops to do that. And it's very difficult to tell in some instances for the really good ones, whether it's, or really bad ones, depending on your point of view, whether they're generated out of whole cloth or somebody did. We have AIs that look at the AIs to see if it's done that way, but they aren't that good either at that. So, yeah, that you're absolutely right. That I think that we saw that a lot starting in the 2016 of the Russian propaganda stuff and some of that stuff. It wasn't so much computer generated, but was I mean, some of it was, but it was mostly, just using the internet to spread misinformation. And I think that we are going to see more and more of this kind of things just made up showing up and being extremely believable. So, yeah.
I mean,
Well,
these things aren't new.
sorry about that from an AI researcher's point of view. So,
I mean, these things aren't new. I mean, they're from the 30s. There was a group called Campaigns Inc. that essentially did a job on Earl Warren and then President Truman doing some health care that was essentially done to Obamacare at the same time. The same kind of techniques, much what we would think
Mhm.
less sophisticated in those days, but every bit as effective. So all of that is still there. I remember, I mean, the sophistication you're talking about of this, I used to watch the stuff about special effects, and there was this one image in The Empire Strikes Back that had, I think, 72 different matte effects on it. It took about a month, and it was about a second and a half of film time. Uh, and now, like you say, you can do all this stuff on your laptop, and it probably still takes a long time, but it doesn't take that, and it doesn't require any
Yeah.
mechanical painting or any of the stuff that was happening in those days. Um, well, we've drifted off our memories, and now we're just pontificating. So it's probably a good time to sort of wrap it up. But does anybody want to sort of, without violating the rules, or violate the rules if you want? This is not a dictatorship yet. So we want to just sort of wrap up with any kind of impressions that you have.
Just an old man's perspective of back in my day it was a lot better, you know, that kind of thing.
Yeah, I think there've always been issues, whether we were aware of them or not. I think today the issues are seem to be broadcast because everybody's wanting to find them and show them to people to get viewership or followers or whatever. And so I think it's maybe a little bit worse, but hopefully we'll learn to deal with it like we've learned to deal with things in the past. Knock on wood.
Yeah, I hope so. Yeah, I think it's the monetization of rage and the ability to tag point to that and really ramp up that element of political non-discourse. I remember there was a Republican, I think he was a senator from Oklahoma, who kind of became a turncoat in ways because he began to accept um, climate change as a real thing, and he was sort of ostracized. He was almost Liz Cheney, by the party. And yet at one point he in the interview with whoever it was, 60 Minutes or something like that, he said, I don't agree with anything Hillary Clinton says. I come back to this over and over again. You don't agree with anything? I mean, Hillary Clinton's not Trotsky. She wasn't Simone de Beauvoir or somebody like that. She's about as centrist as you can get. You can't find one thing to agree with her about except maybe that climate change is right. I mean, once it reaches that point. Now, I realize politically you wouldn't vote for a bill if she said tax rates should be at 10% and you said they should be at 9%. Okay, we can agree you don't agree with her, but that's really in kind. So I think we've reached a point where you can't find within people. I mean, people thought Obama was, Frantz Fanon or somebody like that. He's about as middle of the road as you could get, and yet, and we know, I think, the reasons why that became polarized. But so yeah, we are at a point like that. Maybe we can learn to get beyond that. I think usually something happens, and then there is a divergence in the road. So we'll hope that happens and it's not too painful. But anyway, well, this has been fun. Has it been fun? I think it's been fun. It's certainly been interesting to me.
Interesting.
It may or may not be fun for everybody else. We weren't talking about where everybody got stoned out on Simpsons Lake or anything, which was more entertaining. But I think this hopefully will dredge up some memories for everybody.
Wait, you mean that I could have been making a political statement in the 60s? Getting stoned.
That was it. So this will come out, and as always, comment to us, and if we think of other things, we'll and we get enough response, and the people don't say, don't quit your day jobs. We may do this again pretty soon. I'm sure there will be reasons for us to do that. So
feel free to call me a cuck. It's been done before.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Well, we already know what you are, Roy, and you're also responsible for all that's evil in the world. So there
That's
we go.
right.
About that. Dave, on the other hand, is a Indiana a Republican. Uh,
Yeah.
businessman, and I'm apolitical out here in West Wales or something like that. Anyway, it's great to see everybody. And bye for me, bye for all of you, and we will see you the next time.